The morning was peaceful around the gates of Buckingham Palace. The sun had just begun to rise, painting the stone walls with soft golden light. Tourists gathered along the fences, holding cameras and talking in low voices as they waited for the famous Royal Guard ceremony. Among the crowd walked an elderly man named Arthur Lane. He moved slowly but proudly, his cane tapping lightly on the pavement. He wore an old brown overcoat, with medals pinned neatly on the left side of his chest. The ribbons had faded over the years, but each one carried a story that he still remembered clearly. Arthur was a veteran, once a soldier who had served his country with loyalty and courage. His back was a little bent, his hair was gray, and his steps were careful. But his eyes still held that same steady focus that soldiers carried after years of discipline. Every week, without fail, he came to this very spot. He liked to stand by the black iron railing and watch the Royal Guard march. The sound of boots hitting the ground together brought back memories of his younger days filled with strict order. Long marches, and the brotherhood that only soldiers understand. Some people noticed him right away. A few tourists smiled kindly, while others quietly whispered to each other about the medals he wore. A young boy pointed at him and asked his mother who he was. The woman replied softly that he must be a war hero. Arthur smiled faintly when he overheard that. He never called himself a hero, but he was proud to have done his duty. The cool breeze brushed past his face as he leaned slightly on his cane, waiting for the ceremony to begin. Not far from where he stood, a group of young men stood near the fence as well. They were loud, joking, and full of restless energy. They looked like they had no real interest in the ceremony. They were just hanging around, waiting for something to laugh about. One of them noticed Arthur standing alone and nudged his friend. They both started whispering, then chuckling in a way that made a few tourists turn away uncomfortably. Arthur ignored them at first. He was used to city noise and rude behavior. He had seen worse things in life. His focus remained on the guards in their tall black hats, standing as still as statues in front of the palace. The air was calm for a while. The guards changed position, and the crowd lifted their phones to take pictures. Arthur watched closely, his eyes shining with quiet pride. He remembered standing in formation years ago, his heart beating in rhythm with the sound of commands. He could still feel the weight of his old uniform and the smell of dust after long marches. Every time he came here, those memories returned like old friends, not painful, but meaningful. He came not to remember war, but to remember what unity felt like. What it meant to serve something greater than yourself. But peace never lasts long where mockery hides. The same young men kept watching him. They found it funny that an old man was standing so proudly in front of the palace. One of them, tall and wearing a dark jacket, whispered something to the others, and they all laughed louder. Their laughter was sharp, echoing over the crowd. Arthur heard them now. He turned his head slightly, not to argue, but simply to look at who was making the noise. His calm gaze met their careless eyes. For a moment, neither side said anything. Then the young man smirked and made a joke about Arthur's medals being fake. The others laughed again. Arthur's lips pressed together. He didn't respond. He looked away and faced the palace again. His silence only made them more restless. They wanted a reaction, something to entertain them. Arthur's quiet dignity was something they didn't understand. One of them muttered something under his breath about old fools playing soldier. A nearby tourist frowned but said nothing. The crowd seemed uncomfortable now. Some tried to focus on the guards, but the tension was noticeable. Arthur finally spoke, his voice soft but clear. He didn't raise his tone, didn't show anger. He simply said, "Respect where respect is due, son. Someday you'll understand." His words weren't sharp, but they carried weight. They came from experience, from a man who had seen real struggle, and still chose kindness over pride. For a moment, the young men went quiet. But the silence didn't last. The tall one scoffed and looked away. Pretending not to care, Arthur returned to watching the guards, pretending not to notice them anymore. He adjusted his coat and held his cane firmly. The ceremony continued. The guards moved in rhythm, and the air filled with the sound of drums and commands. But behind him, the laughter started again, quieter this time, but filled with mockery. Arthur took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He reminded himself that dignity wasn't about reacting to disrespect. It was about standing firm, even when others tried to tear you down. He looked around the crowd and saw a few kind faces watching him. A woman smiled softly as if to show her support. A young man nearby nodded respectfully. Those small gestures reminded Arthur that the world still had decency. He didn't need to defend himself with words. The truth was already visible in the way he carried himself with pride. With patience and with quiet strength. A gust of wind swept through the street, and Arthur pulled his coat tighter. The sound of the marching guards grew louder as they approached. The rhythm echoed across the courtyard, boots hitting stone in perfect harmony. Arthur's heart lifted slightly at the sound. He tapped his cane gently in time with the steps, his old soldier's instincts still sharp. For a few brief moments, he forgot about the mockery behind him. All he felt was pride, the same pride he had felt the first day he put on a uniform. The young men eventually drifted back into the edge of the crowd, still whispering and laughing among themselves, but Arthur no longer heard them clearly. His focus was on the present moment, the precision of the guards, the echoing drums, the beauty of tradition carried forward through time. The ceremony reached its midpoint, and the crowd clapped politely. Arthur joined them with a small smile. His hand trembled slightly, but he didn't care. When the applause faded, he leaned on his cane again and stood a little straighter. His knees ached, but his spirit felt steady. In his mind, he thought of his friends, those who never came back, those who would have loved to see a world still guarded by honor. He whispered a quiet thank you under his breath. The morning went on like that, a mix of warmth, memory, and quiet strength. To anyone passing by, Arthur looked like just another old man watching the guards. But to those who truly looked, he was something more. He was a reminder that real courage doesn't always wear armor, and real battles aren't always fought with weapons. Sometimes they are fought with patience, respect, and the refusal to bow to bitterness. Arthur smiled one last time as the guards turned and marched back toward the palace gates. He adjusted his medals, proud to still be standing after all these years. He didn't know that this simple morning visit would soon become something unforgettable, something that would test not only his patience but also the very honor he stood for. The calm before the storm lingered, and the air seemed to hold its breath. Something was about to happen, though no one, not even Arthur, could have guessed how quickly peace could turn to chaos. The laughter started again, a little louder this time. Arthur tried to ignore it, focusing on the guards as they marched with perfect rhythm. But it was becoming harder to block out the voices behind him. The group of young men seemed to grow bolder, feeding on each other's energy. They had seen how calm he was and mistook it for weakness. They thought the old man wouldn't dare to speak again. The leader of the group, the tall one in the dark jacket, stepped closer. He whispered something to his friends and smirked as if he had come up with a joke only he found funny. Arthur stood still, watching the guards perform the ceremony. He did not want any trouble. His cane was steady in his hand, and his back was straight despite his age. The crowd around him began to sense the tension. A few tourists glanced over nervously, unsure whether to say something or stay quiet. Arthur noticed how a family nearby quietly moved a little away, not wanting to be caught in a scene. Still, the guards kept their calm posture, their eyes fixed straight ahead as if nothing was happening. The tall young man took another step forward. "Nice medals, old man," he said, his tone mocking but not loud enough for the guards to react. "You buy those online?" His friends laughed quietly, trying to sound brave, but looking uneasy when some tourists gave them sharp looks. Arthur turned his head slightly. His calm eyes met the young man's. There was no anger in them, just quiet disappointment. He said softly, "Those medals are not for sale, son. They are earned." The words hung in the air like a small bell ringing through silence. The young man looked annoyed. He didn't expect a response that gentle. He had wanted a fight, a reason to keep laughing. But Arthur's calm tone made him feel smaller somehow, and it bothered him. He stepped even closer, standing just a few feet away now. His friends gathered around, trying to look tough. Arthur could smell the sharp scent of their cheap cologne mixed with cigarette smoke. He stayed still, keeping his dignity. Some people in the crowd started recording on their phones. The scene was beginning to draw attention. A woman whispered to her husband to call the police, just in case. A man near the railing shook his head disapprovingly. The tall youth noticed the attention and suddenly seemed uncertain. He laughed again, but his laugh sounded forced. "Don't look so serious, Grandpa," he said. "We're just having fun." Arthur's voice was quiet but steady. "Fun does not come from disrespect," he replied. "You're young. You don't have to act like this." The tall man frowned. He didn't like being talked to as if he were a child. His friends snickered again, trying to push him to say something harsher. The leader reached out and tapped one of Arthur's medals with a single finger. "These don't mean much anymore," he said. Arthur's cane pressed harder against the ground. The noise of the guards marching echoed through the air, but for a moment Arthur could only hear his own heartbeat. He took a slow breath and said, "They meant everything once, and they still do to those who understand sacrifice." The young man smirked, pretending not to care, but his friends shifted uneasily. The crowd around them grew quieter, watching carefully. Then, without thinking, the young man reached out again, this time brushing against Arthur's shoulder. It wasn't a hard push, but it was enough to make the old man stumble slightly. A small gasp came from the crowd. Arthur steadied himself with his cane and looked down at the ground for a moment. His hat tilted forward, and he adjusted it calmly. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He just straightened up again and said nothing. His silence made the air feel heavier. The tall man looked around nervously. He had expected the old man to argue or push back, but the quiet made him feel exposed. One of his friends whispered that maybe they should stop. But pride is a strange thing. It makes people do foolish acts to avoid feeling weak. The leader muttered something about how the old man was pretending to be brave. He took one more step closer, his voice louder now. "You think you're still a soldier? You think anyone cares?" Arthur looked at him quietly. His voice was low but filled with strength. "I don't need anyone to care," he said. "I know who I am." That simple sentence carried more weight than any insult could erase. The people nearby stared in silence. A few tourists murmured words of support, but no one dared move between them. Arthur's eyes didn't waver. For all his years, he still had the same presence he once carried on a battlefield, a calm that came from knowing. Fear but refusing to let it rule him. The tall man hesitated. He was beginning to feel that strange sense of guilt that comes when you realize you are the one in the wrong. But instead of stepping back, he tried to hide it behind laughter. "Look at him," he said to his friends. "Still acting like he's in charge?" He moved closer again, and his shoulder brushed Arthur's arm harder this time. The old man stumbled, and his cane slipped from his grip. It hit the pavement with a sharp clack and rolled a little away. Arthur bent slightly. He was trying to reach for it, but his knee trembled. The crowd gasped, and someone said, "Hey, stop that." The young man froze for a second, then backed up half a step, realizing things were going too far. Arthur managed to steady himself and stood upright once more. A small cut on his palm appeared where he had tried to catch himself, but he ignored it. The guards remained in formation, their discipline unbroken. But the nearest guard's eyes had shifted ever so slightly. He had seen what happened. The royal guard was trained to stay still no matter what, but only as long as there was no real danger. Now, something inside the young soldier's disciplined mind began to stir. Arthur leaned down slowly, picked up his cane, and brushed the dust off it. His movements were calm, careful, and full of quiet pride. He said softly, "You may laugh at an old man, but you should never laugh at what he stood for." His words were not meant to hurt, but they struck deep. The tall youth's expression changed. He looked like he wanted to reply, but the words didn't come. The noise of the guard's boots echoed again, this time sounding louder, closer, heavier. For a moment, everyone in the crowd felt the shift in the air. The guard's steady rhythm and the silence of the people created an atmosphere that even the loud group couldn't break. The leader stepped back slightly, glancing at the soldiers in red uniforms, standing only a few meters away. He didn't want to look afraid, but his confidence was slipping. Arthur's heart was calm again. He took another deep breath, watching the guards. He thought of his old unit, of the men he had served with, and how they had stood side by side, even in the hardest times. He wished these young men could understand that respect was not weakness, it was strength. The crowd began to murmur softly. Some people whispered that someone should step in. Others simply waited, believing that something was about to happen. Arthur adjusted his coat again and stood tall. He had lived through worse than this moment, but he could sense that this wasn't over. The guard's commander, standing at attention near the palace gate, seemed to notice the growing disturbance. He gave a faint motion with his hand, so small only trained eyes would notice it. The ceremony continued, but beneath the music, there was tension now. The crowd watched the young men carefully, and the young men watched Arthur. The tall one looked uneasy, but still refused to back down. The moment stretched longer and longer, the calm before a storm none of them saw coming. Arthur's cane tapped gently against the stone. His eyes were fixed ahead, full of quiet pride, unaware that within moments, something extraordinary was about to unfold, something that would remind everyone standing there that honor, once earned, is never truly forgotten. The sound of boots striking the ground echoed across the courtyard. The royal guard continued their movements with perfect timing, every step crisp and powerful. The ceremony was still going on, but the air had changed. The crowd's attention was no longer on the performance. It was fixed on the space where Arthur Lane stood and the group of young men who had been taunting him. The tall leader of the group stood a few feet from Arthur now. His friends shifted nervously, whispering that maybe it was time to walk away. But pride kept him frozen in place. He had pushed the old man twice already, and though guilt flickered across his face, he didn't want to look weak in front of his friends. Arthur, meanwhile, stood straight with his cane pressed firmly against the ground. He did not look scared. His calm eyes were steady, and that calmness somehow made the young man even more uneasy. A breeze passed through the courtyard, fluttering the flags above the palace. Tourists had their phones raised now, recording in silence. The crowd could feel something about to happen. The guards, who were trained to stay completely still, were not supposed to react to anything. That was one of the most famous rules of the royal guard. They only moved when there was true danger. But one of the guards, standing near the gate, had noticed everything from the beginning. His name was Private William Carter, a young soldier with a clean jawline and a strong sense of duty. He had seen the way the group mocked the old veteran in the moment when Arthur's cane fell to the ground. Carter's training told him to remain still, but his instincts told him otherwise. His eyes, sharp and watchful, followed every movement of the young men. The commander, a stern man named Sergeant Miller, also noticed the disturbance. His face did not move, but his mind was alert. In all his years of service, he had rarely seen someone disrespect a veteran right in front of the palace gates. He waited, hoping it would end peacefully. But he knew he might need to act soon. Arthur adjusted his coat once again, pretending not to notice the stares. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm and steady. "You still have time to walk away," he said quietly. "Don't let foolishness decide what kind of man you become." The words weren't a threat. They were advice from someone who had seen too much of life. The tall young man hesitated, his expression torn between shame and pride. He looked at his friends, who urged him to just leave. But instead he gave a small laugh, trying to cover his nervousness. He muttered something about old men and their stories. And then he took another step toward Arthur. His shoulder brushed the veteran's arm again. This time, Arthur's cane slipped slightly on the stone ground. The sound of metal on stone cut through the quiet. The crowd gasped. That small noise was enough. Sergeant Miller's eyes met Private Carter's for a brief second. With the smallest motion, a nod so subtle that only trained soldiers could see it, the sergeant gave permission to act. Carter took one slow breath. Then, breaking the famous stillness of the royal guard, he took a single step forward. The sharp sound of his boot hitting the pavement cracked through the silence. The entire crowd froze. The sound carried a weight far greater than words. Even the young men stopped moving. Arthur turned his head slightly, surprised by the sound. The guard stood tall, his rifle held firmly against his shoulder, his eyes cold and focused. When he spoke, his voice was deep and calm, filled with authority. "Step away from him," he said. "Now." The words echoed in the open space. The crowd murmured softly, pulling their phones higher to record. The young man blinked in disbelief. "We're not doing anything," he said quickly, his tone suddenly defensive. But his voice trembled slightly. His friends backed away a few steps, realizing the situation had changed. Carter didn't move closer yet, but his eyes never left them. Behind him, the other guards remained perfectly still, their faces blank, but everyone knew they were ready to act if needed. Sergeant Miller gave another small hand signal, barely visible, but it meant prepare. Arthur stood between them, still calm. He looked at the guard, then at the young men. "You heard him," Arthur said softly. "It's time to walk away." His tone wasn't angry. It was almost gentle, like a teacher trying to help his students learn a hard lesson. The tall man hesitated again. Glancing at the crowd, he could feel dozens of eyes on him, watching every move. The courage he had faked earlier was fading fast. He stepped back a little, muttering something about it all being a misunderstanding. But then, trying to save face, he gave a small laugh. "We're fine," he said loudly, trying to sound confident. "No one's hurt." The guard's voice came again, steady and firm. "You will move back from this man," Carter said, "and you will not touch him again." His tone was respectful, but there was no room for argument. The tall man looked around, realizing how serious the situation had become. The guards were famous for never speaking, never breaking formations so when they did. Everyone understood the gravity of it. A few police officers stationed near the side gates began to walk toward the scene. The crowd made space for them, whispering excitedly. Arthur remained where he was, his heart beating a little faster but his face calm. He was watching the young guard with quiet admiration. He saw something in that soldier's eyes, a reflection of the same discipline and courage he had once known so well. The young man in the dark jacket took another hesitant step back. His friends followed. For a second, it seemed like things would end quietly. The guards would return to position, the crowd would relax, and Arthur would continue his peaceful mourning. But pride, once again, has a way of pushing people too far. The tall man turned slightly, looked at the guard, then back at Arthur, and muttered something under his breath that no one could quite hear. Before anyone could react, he bent slightly as if reaching for Arthur's cane that had fallen earlier, but to the guards. It looked like a sudden movement toward the old man. The reaction was instant. Two guards, including Carter, stepped forward in perfect synchronization. Their boots struck the ground hard and clear. The tall man froze, realizing too late what he had done. The crowd gasped again, some clapping quietly in support of the guard's discipline. The energy in the air shifted completely. No more mockery, no more laughter. The young men's faces had turned pale. Carter lowered his rifle slightly, keeping it close but not threatening. His voice was quiet but carried strength. "Do not move again," he said. The tall man raised his hands slowly, his pride gone now, replaced with nervous respect. All right, he muttered. "We're leaving." His friends nodded quickly, backing away. The guards did not chase them, they only stood their ground. Their calm presence saying more than words ever could. Arthur took a slow breath. The noise of the ceremony had faded in his mind. All he could hear now was the steady beat of boots and his own heartbeat. One of the guards, a few steps away, looked at him briefly. Their eyes met. The young soldier's expression softened slightly before he turned back to his duty. Police officers arrived moments later. Moving through the crowd, the guards stepped back into formation, returning to their positions as if nothing had happened. But everyone watching knew they had just seen something rare, a moment when honor moved faster than pride. When tradition became protection, Arthur leaned on his cane and looked at the guards once more. His eyes glistened slightly, though he didn't cry. He gave the smallest nod of respect, and though the guards didn't respond outwardly, he could feel that they understood. The crowd began to clap softly, not loudly, not chaotically, but in quiet admiration. Even the tourists who didn't fully understand what had happened felt something powerful in that moment. The tall young man and his friends disappeared into the edge of the crowd, their laughter gone. The police would soon catch up to them, but for now, the courtyard was calm again. The ceremony resumed, the guards moving with flawless discipline. But the people who had witnessed that small moment of courage would not forget it. Arthur stayed for a while longer. He stood silently watching the guards, thinking of how even in a modern world full of noise and distraction, respect still had a place. It only needed someone brave enough to remind others what it looked like. He smiled faintly, his heart proud. He didn't know that before the day ended, this quiet act of courage would spread far beyond that courtyard, showing thousands of people around the world that true honor never ages. It only changes hands from one generation to the next. The tall young man stood frozen, his breath caught as the two guards moved forward in perfect rhythm. Their boots hit the ground with sharp precision, the sound echoing off the stone walls like thunder. The leader of the group tried to smile, but his confidence had already vanished. His friends were backing away slowly, realizing the mistake they had made. The guards did not raise their voices or their weapons. They didn't need to. Their presence alone carried a power that silenced everyone. Even the tourists who had been whispering moments before were now completely quiet. Arthur Lane stood in the middle of it all, his cane steady in his hand. His heart was beating faster than before, but his face showed calm dignity. He had faced far worse moments in his life. This one, however, touched something deep inside him, a strange mix of pride and sadness. He had never wanted anyone to step in for him, but seeing those young soldiers act with such discipline reminded him that the spirit of service still lived on. The tall young man swallowed hard. "Hey, we didn't mean anything," he said quickly, his voice shaky. "We were just joking." The guard closest to him, Private Carter, didn't blink. His tone was calm but firm. "Step away from the man," he said again. Now, the command was clear, sharp, and final. The tall man nodded quickly and moved back. His friends followed, their heads lowered. They tried to act casual, but their faces were pale. A police officer hurried over from the side of the courtyard, guided by the murmurs of the crowd. The officer had already seen enough people were pointing toward the group and explaining what had happened. The officer stopped near the guards, and Carter gave a brief nod before returning his focus to the young men. The officer's voice was professional but direct. "You three over here," he said. Now, the crowd began to part as the officer guided them aside. The tourists started clapping quietly, not loudly like a celebration, but softly, as if showing gratitude for something honorable. Arthur took a deep breath, his hand trembling slightly as he held his cane. He looked at Private Carter and said softly, "Thank you, son." The guard didn't speak but gave a small nod, his expression respectful. He then stepped back into formation, his rifle against his shoulder, his stance returning to perfect discipline. The other guards followed suit, moving in perfect unison until they stood as if nothing had happened. The officer asked Arthur if he was all right. Arthur nodded, smiling faintly. "I'm fine," he said. "They just needed a reminder." His voice was calm, but his eyes showed emotion. The officer gave him a respectful nod and assured him that the matter would be handled. The young men were no longer smirking or joking. Their earlier laughter had been replaced with silence. They were led aside by the officers, who spoke to them firmly. The atmosphere began to change again. The tension that had filled the air started to fade, replaced by quiet admiration. The tourists still gathered near the railings, whispered among themselves. Some were wiping away tears, others recording the moment with their phones. A mother told her little boy softly that he should always respect people who serve others. The boy looked at Arthur with wide eyes, as if seeing a hero for the first time. Arthur felt the warmth of the morning sun on his face. He looked up at the palace gates and then back at the guards. They stood tall, motionless, their red coats bright against the gray stone. He thought about the years he had worn a uniform himself, standing in storms, in heat, in silence. He remembered the times when courage meant not shouting or fighting, but simply standing firm for what was right. The officer returned after a few minutes and told Arthur that the situation was under control. "They'll be taken in for questioning," the officer said gently. "But they won't be bothering anyone else today." Arthur nodded gratefully. He didn't want revenge. He only wanted peace. He looked at the crowd and gave a small smile, and a few people clapped softly again. Private Carter stood silently in position, but inside he felt something too. He had joined the Royal Guard to serve with pride, to protect tradition and dignity. Today, he had done that in a way he would remember for the rest of his life. When the commander gave the order to resume normal routine, Carter felt a sense of calm pride. He had acted not just as a soldier, but as a man honoring another who had served before him. Arthur slowly made his way to a nearby bench, the help of a kind woman who offered her arm. He sat down, catching his breath. His legs ached, but his spirit felt light. The crowd began to disperse slowly, though many people turned back to give him one last look of respect. A few even thanked him quietly before walking away. The officer approached one last time, saluting him respectfully. Arthur returned the gesture, his hands steady and his eyes warm. He looked around and noticed something beautiful. The world had stopped, just for a moment, to remember what respect looked like. It wasn't about medals or uniforms. It was about values that could not fade with time. He looked at the guards once more and thought to himself that his country was still in good hands. The guards stood there, protecting not just the palace, but also the dignity of those who had come before them. As the morning sun grew stronger, Arthur felt tired but peaceful. He knew that what had happened today would leave a mark not because it was dramatic or loud, but because it showed quiet courage. It showed that honor still existed in everyday life. People often forgot that, but today they had seen it clearly. The crowd thinned until only a few tourists remained. Arthur stood up slowly, gripping his cane. He took one last look at the guards before turning to leave. His steps were slow but steady. The police officer held the gate open for him and said softly, "Have a good day, sir." Arthur smiled. "It already has been," he replied, as he walked down the street, his coat swaying gently. He could still hear the faint sound of the guards' boots marching in rhythm behind him. Each step reminded him of everything he had stood for: discipline, respect, and service. For the first time in a long while, he felt that those values were not lost after all. The new generation had shown they still remembered. A few minutes later, as he disappeared into the street's crowd, a small breeze carried the faint echo of applause behind him. It wasn't loud, but it was sincere. The city had moved on with its usual noise, but for those who had been there, the moment stayed in their hearts. The thugs had learned their lesson, the guard had shown bravery, and Arthur had reminded everyone that respect was not something that could be demanded. It was something that was earned and shared through quiet strength. That evening, videos of the event began to spread across social media. People from different countries watched the scene, many leaving kind comments about the guards and the old veteran. Some said it was the most touching thing they had seen all week. Others wrote that the world needed more moments like this, moments that reminded people what honor meant. Arthur didn't know about the videos yet. He was at home, sitting by his window, looking out at the soft lights of the city. His medals were still pinned to his coat, shining faintly under the lamp. He smiled as he thought of the young guard who had stepped forward without fear. It gave him peace to know that even after all these years, bravery still stood where it was needed most. He leaned back in his chair, feeling grateful. In his heart, he knew he had not been alone out there. The spirit of every soldier, past and present, had stood with him. He closed his eyes for a moment, the soft sound of marching boots still echoing in his memory, a rhythm that would never fade. The next morning came quietly. The streets around Buckingham Palace were calm again, filled with the usual mix of tourists and locals moving about, but there was something different in the air, a sense of quiet respect. Overnight, the story of the elderly veteran and the royal guard had spread across the internet. Videos of the moment had been shared thousands of times. People from all over the world were commenting, calling it an act of courage and decency. But Arthur Lane did not know that yet. He woke up early, as he always did, made himself a simple cup of tea, and looked at his medals laid neatly on the small table beside him. He didn't wear the medals every day, only on the mornings when he planned to visit the palace. For him, it wasn't about showing off. It was about remembering. Each medal reminded him of a friend he had once served with, a moment of duty, a piece of history he carried in his heart. He had worn those medals for decades, and no matter how many years passed, they never lost their meaning. That morning, as he buttoned his coat and picked up his cane, he noticed a letter slipped under his door. It was from a neighbor who had seen the video online. Inside was a simple note that said, "You made us proud, Mr. Lane. The whole street is talking about you." Arthur read it slowly, smiling softly. He didn't quite understand what it meant yet, but he appreciated the words. He put the letter in his pocket and stepped outside. The air was crisp, and the city was waking up. The sound of traffic mixed with the soft coo of pigeons near the park. Arthur walked at his usual slow pace, his cane tapping lightly with each step. It was the same path he took every week to the palace gates. Along the way, a few strangers smiled at him. Some even nodded politely, as if recognizing him from somewhere. He smiled back, unsure of why they seemed to know him. When he reached the palace area, there was already a small crowd forming. The ceremony had not yet begun, but people were gathered near the railings, talking excitedly. Arthur moved through them quietly, finding his usual spot. As he took his place, a few people noticed him and began to whisper. One young woman pointed and said softly, "That's him." Another man nodded, lifting his phone as if to confirm. Before long, more people were looking his way. Arthur felt puzzled but didn't say anything. Then, from the courtyard, one of the guards noticed him. It was Private Carter. Though the guards were not supposed to move or speak, Carter's eyes softened slightly when he saw Arthur again. He recognized the same calm, proud figure from the day before. When the ceremony began, everything happened in perfect order as always commands were called. Boots struck the ground and the crowd watched in awe, but when the guard line turned to face the people, Carter's glance lingered for just a fraction of a second longer in Arthur's direction. It was not much, but it was enough. After the ceremony ended, the crowd began to clap politely. Some stayed longer, hoping to see the guards march back through the gate. Arthur stood quietly, watching with a soft smile. He was about to leave when a police officer approached him. It was the same officer from the day before. "Good morning, sir," the officer said kindly. "I thought you might like to know the video from yesterday has gone all over the internet. People are calling you a hero." Arthur blinked, surprised. "A hero?" he repeated softly. "No, I'm just an old man who happened to be there." The officer smiled. "That may be true, sir, but sometimes the right example at the right moment reminds people what matters." He paused. "The guard who stepped forward asked me to tell you something. He said your calmness gave him courage to act." Arthur looked down at his cane for a moment, touched by the words. "He's a fine soldier," he said quietly, "the kind that makes you proud to have served once." As they spoke, a small group of people nearby recognized him and began to approach. A mother with her daughter stepped closer. The little girl held a small paper flag and said shyly, "Thank you, sir." Arthur smiled warmly and bent down a little. "For what, young lady?" he asked kindly. The girl replied softly, "For being brave." Her words were simple but pure. Arthur's heart swelled with emotion. He gently patted her shoulder and said, "Bravery isn't about fighting, dear. It's about standing for what's right, even when it's quiet." The crowd around him began to grow. More people came forward to greet him, shake his hand, or simply say thank you. Someone handed him a small bouquet of flowers. Another person asked to take a picture with him. Arthur was a bit overwhelmed, but he accepted it with humility. He didn't enjoy attention, but he saw in their faces something he hadn't seen in a long time: genuine gratitude. As the morning went on, a royal official quietly approached him. He was a tall man in a dark suit who spoke respectfully. "Mr. Lane," he said, "His Majesty's staff has asked me to extend their appreciation. The palace would like to thank you for representing the values we hold dear." Arthur's eyes widened in surprise. He wasn't expecting that. "That's very kind," he replied softly. "I just did what anyone should do." The official smiled. "Not everyone remembers, sir, but you reminded them." A short while later, Private Carter appeared at a short distance, still in full uniform. Though the guards rarely broke their strict formation, the commander had given permission for him to approach for a brief moment after the ceremony. The crowd noticed and went silent as the young guard walked toward Arthur. When he stopped in front of him, he stood at attention and raised his hand in a respectful salute. Arthur slowly lifted his own trembling hand and returned the gesture. The scene was quiet, but it carried deep meaning. The old soldier and the young guard, generations apart. stood facing each other in shared respect. A few tourists had tears in their eyes. The moment felt timeless, something beyond words, something that spoke straight to the heart. Carter lowered his salute and said quietly, "It was an honor to stand for you, sir." Arthur smiled, his eyes warm. "No, son," he replied softly. "It was an honor to see what the future of duty looks like." Carter gave a small nod, then stepped back, returning to his place. The crowd clapped gently once again. Not as a performance, but as a tribute. For a brief moment, even the usual noise of the city seemed to fade. There was only the quiet rhythm of shared pride. When the day ended, Arthur sat again on his favorite bench near the palace gates. The flowers people had given him rested on his lap. He looked at the guards in the distance, their bright red coats shining under the afternoon sun. The same calm peace he always felt when visiting returned to him. But now it was joined by something else, a deep sense of gratitude. He thought about everything that had happened, the mockery, the courage, the justice, and the unexpected kindness that followed. He realized that sometimes life tested people not to break them, but to show others what dignity looked like. What had started as a morning walk had turned into something much greater, a lesson that even in a world full of noise and distraction, honor could still be seen clearly when people chose to do what was right. As the crowd thinned and evening drew near, Arthur prepared to leave. He stood slowly, using his cane for balance. Before turning away, he looked one last time toward the guards. Private Carter was standing among them again, completely still, his posture perfect. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, and Carter gave the smallest, almost invisible nod. It was a gesture only Arthur could notice, but it meant everything. Arthur smiled. He turned and began his walk home, each step slow but steady. The streets glowed softly under the sunset. The world felt peaceful again. He passed by a small cafe where people were watching the video of the event on their phones. He heard his own name mentioned, followed by quiet words of admiration. It made him smile, but he didn't stop. Fame wasn't what he had ever wanted. What mattered most to him was knowing that the young had seen the example and understood. That night, as Arthur sat by his window, the city lights reflected off the medals pinned to his coat. He took them off carefully and placed them on the table. His eyes rested on them for a long moment before he whispered softly, "You did your part once more." Then he leaned back and closed his eyes. Outside in the distance, the faint sound of marching boots could still be heard. It wasn't real, but in his heart it was. The rhythm of duty, respect, and courage, something that never faded with time. And so, the story of the old veteran and the Royal Guard became more than just a passing moment. It became a reminder for everyone who heard it that kindness and honor were not old-fashioned ideas. They were the foundation of what made people truly strong. And somewhere in the quiet heart of London, an old soldier rested, proud to know that the flame of dignity he had carried all his life was still burning brightly in the hands of the young.